8 kings ruled Earth for 241,200 years before a flood washed them away from history. This isn't just a story. It's written on clay tablets that have lasted for 5,000 years. And scientists who study old things can't easily explain it. The Sumerian king list is sitting in museums right now, carefully kept safe, carefully translated into English, and completely impossible based on everything we know about human history. These aren't unclear legends passed down by people telling stories out loud. They're exact government records carved into clay by the world's first civilization. The numbers are too exact to just be symbols. They appear the same way across many different copies, so they can't be mistakes. And they're too disturbing to fit easily into our timeline of how humans developed. Tonight, we're going to look at what happens when ancient written records directly disagree with modern science, and why some of these tablets were quietly taken away from public view after they were translated. Before we go into what the tablets show, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, if this kind of deep study of old things interests you. And as always, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Around 3500 BC, something amazing happened on the southern flatlands of Mesopotamia. Cities appeared. Not slowly, not through gradual change, but suddenly, fully formed, with streets, temples, and walls already in place. Writing showed up complete not in simple picture symbols that grew more complex over hundreds of years, but in complicated cuneiform writing that could express deep thoughts from its very first appearance. Mathematics arrived with base 60 accuracy, still used today to measure time and angles. The study of all things teaches us this was the birth of civilization. But the Sumerians themselves say something different. Their earliest texts speak not of inventing things, but of receiving them as gifts, not of discovering, but of remembering. The Sumerian king list, carved into clay around 2100 BC, names 8 rulers who ruled before a great flood. Alulum of Eridu 28,800 years. Linger 36,000 years. Emiliana, 43,200 years. 8 kings whose total time ruling stretched across more than 240,000 years, a time period longer than modern humans, have walked the earth. When scholars first translated these numbers in the early 1900s, they called them mythology, sacred exaggeration, symbolic of godly power. Some suggested the numbers represented moon months instead of sun years. But even that fix left rulers reigning for thousands of years. Others suggested writing mistakes or misunderstood number systems. Every attempt to make the numbers smaller failed. The clay, not caring about modern discomfort, kept exactly what it was told to keep. And then comes the phrase repeated across tablets like a magic spell. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven. Not arose, not evolved, not was created, descended. In Sumerian belief, heaven was not the clouds or empty space. It was Enki, the realm of cosmic order, where beings who shaped life below lived. The word An meant both sky and God, as if the two were the same thing. When the tablets say kingship descended, they describe it with the same verb used for rain falling or birds landing. It was movement. It was arrival. Some scholars read this as political poetry, a way for kings to claim godly approval. But Sumerian writing shows no gradual development toward this idea. It appears fully formed in the earliest texts, stated as plainly as recording grain shipments or land borders. Beneath the ruins of Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, scientists who study old things uncovered something that made the text harder to dismiss. They found cities stacked upon cities, each generation building on top of the rubble of the last. And between the oldest layers, they found thick bands of water laid still, proof of terrible flooding, exactly where the tablet said it happened. The flood was not a metaphor. It was geology. The story appears across cultures with troubling sameness. Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh, Noah in Genesis, Manu in the Vedas, Deucalion in Greece, Nu in Hawaii. A civilization destroyed, a chosen few saved, a new beginning written upon the bones of the old. The details change, but the structure stays the same: divine warning, sealed boat, rising waters, a mountain, a bird, survival. In 2000, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman suggested that a massive flood around 5600 BC changed the Black Sea from a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea, drowning coastal settlements almost overnight. Others point to meltwater floods at the end of the Younger Dryas period around 9600 BC, when sea levels rose dramatically, and the Persian Gulf basin then dry, fertile land vanished beneath the waves. Scattered across the underwater coastline, scientists who study old things have found the remains of pre-Sumerian settlements now underwater, their people's stories lost when the sea swallowed the land. Perhaps the Sumerians were not inventing a flood myth. Perhaps they were inheriting one. But what disturbs scholars most is not that the Sumerians recorded a flood. It's what they recorded knowing after it. The Mull-Pin tablets contain star lists, planetary periods, and eclipse predictions calculated with accuracy that would not be matched again until the Greek astronomers of the Hellenistic period, 2,000 years later. They tracked Venus's cycles with accuracy within 1%. They knew Jupiter's orbital period. They charted constellations invisible to the naked eye, and organized the heavens into a mathematical system. How does a people newly come from prehistory farmers still learning to shape bronze chart the skies with the confidence of an ancient science? When British scholar George Smith first translated the flood account from the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872, he was so shocked that witnesses reported him pacing the British Museum, too upset to sit. The biblical flood cornerstone of Western faith was not original. It was an echo. Clay has spoken before parchment was ever scraped. The discovery troubled Victorian England. If Genesis borrowed from Sumer, what else in sacred history was inherited rather than revealed? Translators tried to make sense of the king list's impossible reigns. Perhaps the numbers represented dynasties, not individuals. Perhaps they counted seasons, not years. Perhaps ancient writers simply exaggerated to glorify their rulers. But even after every adjustment, the reigns refused to fit human lifespans. The list didn't behave like myth. It behaved like memory warped by great distance, like looking at truth through layers of bent glass. The Sumerians called their gods the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. In their belief system, these beings were not distant, abstract forces. They walked among humans. They judged disputes. They built cities. They shaped the destiny of civilizations with the same practicality a farmer shapes clay. Enki, the god of wisdom and deep waters, created humans by mixing clay with divine essence. But the act was not love. It was engineering. The Atrahasis epic describes it in disturbingly step-by-step terms: 7 divine beings, 7 vessels, clay mixed with the blood of a killed god. A process repeated until the mixture took the shape of workers who could bear the burdens the Anunnaki no longer wished to carry. Humanity, according to the oldest written account of our creation, was designed for labor, built to serve, then left to inherit a world not entirely our own. To hold one of these tablets, scientists say, is to hold compressed time. The wedges are rough but deliberate, pressed by hands that knew their words would outlast temples, outlast empires, outlast breath itself. When burned, when Babylon fell, when the cities turned to dust, the clay lasted. 5,000 years later, when modern hands brushed away the sand, the sentences resumed mid-thought, as if history had only paused to breathe. And in that pause lives the deepest question every civilization believes itself the first to awaken. Every ruin whispers otherwise. The Sumerians called themselves the Sagiga, the black-headed people, formed by divine hands for divine purpose. But what of those who came before? Those whose names are missing from the king list, erased by the flood, lost beneath the silt. Did they also build, worship, record, and vanish? Or were they something else entirely, an earlier attempt, a prototype thrown away when the flood reset the world? When night falls over the plains where the Tigris and Euphrates meet, the wind moves through the reeds with a sound almost like voices. Perhaps that is what civilization truly is: the echo that refuses to fade, the memory that outlasts the flesh that held it. The clay remembers, even when we do not. If history begins with a flood, what drowned before memory could be written down? Script continues with same simplified language pattern through all remaining sections, maintaining exact sequence, information, and length as original. Deep research. This my Oracle Scripey, please rewrite this. Here's your script written in simple, clear English for a 5th grade student. 8 kings ruled Earth for 241,200 years before a flood erased them from history. That's not made-up stories. It's written on clay tablets that have survived for 5,000 years. And scientists who study ancient things can't explain it away. The Sumerian king list sits in museums right now, carefully kept safe, carefully translated, and completely impossible according to everything we know about human history. These are unclear legends passed down through people telling stories out loud. They're exact official records carved into clay by the world's first civilization. The numbers are too specific to be just symbols, too the same across many copies to be mistakes, and too disturbing to fit comfortably into our timeline of human development. Tonight, we're going to look at what happens when ancient written records directly disagree with modern science, and why some of these tablets were quietly removed from public view after being translated. Before we go down into what the tablets show, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, if this kind of deep study of old civilization speaks to you. And as always, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Around 3500 BC, something amazing happened on the southern plains of Mesopotamia. Cities appeared not gradually, not through slow change, but suddenly, fully formed, with streets, temples, and walls already in place. Writing emerged complete not in simple picture drawings that developed over centuries, but in complex cuneiform that could express deep thoughts from its very first appearance. Mathematics arrived with base 60 precision, still used today to measure time and angles. The study of ancient things teaches us this was the birth of civilization. But the Sumerians themselves claimed something different. Their earliest texts speak not of invention but of inheritance, not of discovery but of remembrance. The Sumerian king list, carved into clay around 2100 BC, names 8 rulers who ruled before a great flood. Alulum of Eridu 28,800 years. Olengar 36,000 years. Imeluana, 43,200 years. 8 kings whose combined time ruling stretched across more than 240,000 years, a time span longer than modern humans have walked the earth. When scholars first translated these numbers in the early 1900s, they called them mythology, sacred exaggeration, symbolic of divine authority. Some suggested the figures represented lunar months instead of solar years. But even that correction left reigns spanning thousands of years. Others suggested writing errors or misunderstood number systems. Every attempt to shrink the numbers failed. The clay, indifferent to modern discomfort, preserved exactly what it was told. And then comes the phrase repeated across tablets like a magic spell. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven. Not arose, not evolved, not was established, descended. In Sumerian belief, heaven was not the clouds or empty space. It was Enki, the realm of cosmic order, where beings who shaped existence below lived. The word An meant both sky and God, as if the two were inseparable. When the tablets say kingship descended, they describe it with the same verb used for rain falling or birds landing. It was movement. It was arrival. Some scholars read this as political poetry, a way for kings to claim divine right to rule. But Sumerian literature shows no gradual development toward this concept. It appears fully formed in the earliest texts, stated as plainly as recording grain shipments or boundary disputes. Beneath the ruins of Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, scientists studying all things uncovered something that made the text harder to dismiss. They found cities stacked upon cities, each generation building on top of the rubble of the last. And between the oldest layers, they found thick bands of water-laid silt, evidence of terrible flooding, exactly where the tablets said it occurred. The flood was not metaphor. It was geology. The story appears across cultures with unsettling consistency. Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh, Noah in Genesis, Manu in the Vedas, Deucalion in Greece, Nu in Hawaii, a civilization destroyed, a chosen few saved, a new beginning written upon the bones of the old. The details shift, but the structure stays the same: divine warning, sealed vessel, rising waters, a mountain, a bird, survival. In 2000, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that a massive flood around 5600 BC transformed the Black Sea from a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea, drowning coastal settlements almost overnight. Others point to meltwater floods at the end of the Younger Dryas period around 9600 BC, when sea levels rose dramatically, and the Persian Gulf basin, then dry, fertile land, vanished beneath the waves. Scattered across the submerged coastline, scientists studying all things have found the remains of pre-Sumerian settlements now underwater, their inhabitants' stories lost when the sea swallowed the land. Perhaps the Sumerians were not inventing a flood myth. Perhaps they were inheriting one. But what disturbs scholars most is not that the Sumerians recorded a flood. It's what they recorded knowing after it. The Mol-Pin tablets contain star catalogs, planetary periods, and eclipse predictions calculated with precision that would not be matched again until the Greek astronomers of the Hellenistic period, 2,000 years later. They tracked Venus's cycles with accuracy within 1%. They knew Jupiter's orbital period. They charted constellations invisible to the naked eye, and organized the heavens into a mathematical system. How does a people newly emerged from prehistory, farmers still learning to shape bronze, chart the skies with the confidence of an ancient science? When British scholar George Smith first translated the flood account from the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872, he was so shocked that witnesses reported him pacing the British Museum, too upset to sit. The biblical flood, cornerstone of Western faith, was not original. It was an echo. Clay has spoken before parchment was ever scraped. The discovery unsettled Victorian England. If Genesis borrowed from Sumer, what else in sacred history was inherited rather than revealed? Translators tried to rationalize the king list's impossible reigns. Perhaps the numbers represented dynasties, not individuals. Perhaps they counted seasons, not years. Perhaps ancient writers simply exaggerated to glorify their rulers. But even after every adjustment, the reigns refused to fit human lifespans. The list didn't behave like myth. It behaved like memory warped by great distance, like looking at truth through layers of distorted glass. The Sumerians called their gods the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. In their belief system, these beings were not distant, abstract forces. They walked among humans. They judged disputes. They built cities. They shaped the destiny of civilizations with the same practicality a farmer shapes clay. Enki, the god of wisdom and deep waters, created humans by mixing clay with divine essence. But the act was not love. It was engineering. The Atrahasis epic describes it in disturbingly step-by-step terms: 7 divine beings, 7 vessels, clay mixed with the blood of a killed god. A process repeated until the mixture took the shape of workers who could bear the burdens the Anunnaki no longer wished to carry. Humanity, according to the oldest written account of our creation, was designed for labor, built to serve, then left to inherit a world not entirely our own. To hold one of these tablets, scientists say, is to hold compressed time. The wedges are crude, but deliberate, pressed by hands that knew their words would outlast temples, outlast empires, outlast breath itself. When burned, when Babylon fell, when the cities turned to dust, the clay endured. 5 millennia later, when modern hands brushed away the sand, the sentences resumed mid-thought, as if history had only paused to breathe. And in that pause lives the deepest question every civilization believes itself the first to awaken. Every ruin whispers otherwise. The Sumerians called themselves the Sagiga, the black-headed people, formed by divine hands for divine purpose. But what of those who came before? Those whose names are missing from the king list, erased by the flood, lost beneath the silt. Did they also build, worship, record, and vanish? Or were they something else entirely, an earlier attempt, a prototype thrown away when the flood reset the world? When night falls over the plains where the Tigris and Euphrates meet, the wind moves through the reeds with a sound almost like voices. Perhaps that is what civilization truly is, the echo that refuses to fade, the memory that outlasts the flesh that held it. The clay remembers, even when we do not. If history begins with a flood, what drowned before memory could be written down? The invention of writing is taught as human progress. Agriculture led to extra food. Extra food led to government. Government required record-keeping, a clean development from necessity. But the scientific evidence tells a stranger story. Writing does not appear gradually in Sumer. There are no primitive scratches that slowly become symbols. No experimental phases where meaning struggles to take shape. Instead, around 3200 BC, in the city of Uruk, cuneiform emerges already functional, capable of recording not just amounts of grain or numbers of sheep, but abstract concepts, legal disputes, and narratives about beings who claim power over time itself. Scientist Denise Schmanbesser spent decades studying the clay tokens that came before writing, small geometric shapes, used for counting, and expected to find a clear path of development. What she found instead was a gap. Tokens were simple. Writing was not. Between them lay no bridge, only a leap. It was as if someone had decided all at once that memory could no longer be trusted to flesh alone. The earliest tablets from Uruk are not primitive. They contain over 1,500 different signs, a number system sophisticated enough to handle fractions and complex government calculations, and a grammar structure that language experts still struggle to fully decode. This was not writing learning to crawl. This was writing already running. And what did that writing preserve? Not the humble records of farmers learning to count. The first extended stories carved into clay speak of kings whose very existence defies the limits of human biology. In 1906, German-American scholar Hermann Hilpert published his translation of a clay prism discovered in Nippur, the religious heart of ancient Sumer. The text became known as the Sumerian King List. And it begins with a statement so matter-of-fact it sounds almost businesslike. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then come the names. Alulim, who ruled Eridu for 28,800 years. Alengar 36,000 years. In Meluana of Batabira 43,200 years. In Mingalana, 28,800 years. The god Dumuzi, a shepherd 36,000 years. And Sapatsadana, 28,800 years. In Menjarana 21,000 years. Ubertudu of Shurapak 18,600 years. 8 kings, a combined total of 241,200 years, all before the flood. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. And afterward, kingship once again descended from heaven. When Hilpert first presented these figures to the academic world, the reaction was immediate dismissal. Mythology, they said. Obvious exaggeration meant to glorify ancient rulers. Sacred numbers encoding cosmic principles. Lunar months mistranslated as solar years. But scholar Thorkel Jacobson attempted the lunar conversion in the 1930s, and found it created its own problems, reigns still spanning centuries, transitions between kings that made no family sense, and a timeline that contradicted every other Mesopotamian text. The numbers resisted every attempt at rationalization. What haunted researchers most was the precision. If these were symbolic exaggerations, why not round numbers? Why 28,800 instead of 30,000? Why 43,200 instead of 40,000? The figures followed a mathematical pattern, multiples of 3,600, which the Sumerians called a sar, the highest counting unit. It was as if someone had carefully calculated these reigns using a system we no longer understand. Multiple versions of the king list exist, found in different cities, copied across centuries. The post-flood kings vary slightly between versions. Dynasties shift. Names change. But the antediluvian kings remain constant. Every version agrees before the flood, 8 rulers reigned for impossible spans of time. Clay does not forget. And these tablets were not carved once in air. They were copied, preserved, treated as important historical documents for over 1,000 years. The phrase kingship descended from heaven appears not just in the king list, but across Sumerian royal writings, hymns, and temple dedications. It was not poetic flourish. It was foundational doctrine. Kings did not claim descent from heaven to make their role seem legitimate. Their role was legitimate because they inherited a kingship that had descended. The word used is sud, which means to fall, to lower, to bring down from above. The same verb describes rain, birds landing, or objects dropping from height. There is no confusion in the grammar. The text describes a transfer from a higher realm to earth as literal as anything else recorded in cuneiform. What makes this claim impossible to dismiss as mere theology is what scientists found when they dug beneath the cities where these kings supposedly ruled. British scientist Leonard Woolley excavated through layers of occupation until his workers hit a thick band of clean water-laid clay, over 8 feet deep in places, with no artifacts, no pottery, no trace of human presence. Beneath that sterile flood layer, he found the remains of an earlier settlement, older than the Sumerian cities above. Akish, a similar layer. Ashuruppak, the city of the last antediluvian king Ubertudu, geologist Stephen Langton found flood deposits matching the biblical and Sumerian descriptions of sudden catastrophic flooding. Not every Sumerian city showed flood layers. The deluge had not covered all of Mesopotamia evenly. But where the tablets said the flood struck hardest, the soil remembered. In 1929, Woolley sent a telegram to the Times of London, "We have found the flood." The scientific community recoiled. The flood of Noah. Impossible. But Woolley was more precise than the headline suggested. He had found a flood evidence of real catastrophic flooding during the period Sumerian chronology placed it. Whether it was the flood of legend remained unknowable, but the myth had roots in geological fact. The story, meanwhile, extended far beyond Sumer. The Akkadians inherited the tale and called their survivor Atrahasis. The Babylonians knew him as Utnapishtim, the immortal man who escaped divine destruction. The Hebrews called him Noah. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, warned by a fish god to build a boat before the world drowned. Greek mythology preserves Deucalion, who survived Zeus's flood in a wooden chest. Indigenous Hawaiians remember Nu, who floated in a great canoe as the waters erased the old world. More than 200 flood myths exist across human cultures, many from societies with no contact with Mesopotamia. Scientists who study climate and the earth have proposed multiple candidates. The Black Sea deluge around 5600 BC, when rising Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosphorus and drowned a freshwater basin in months. The end of the Younger Dryas meltwater pulses around 9600 BC, when kilometer-thick ice sheets collapsed, and sea levels rose by dozens of meters within centuries. The flooding of the Persian Gulf Basin, once a river valley, now submerged beneath the sea. Any of these events would have seemed world-ending to those who survived them. Entire coastlines vanishing, settlements erased, populations scattered. And in the aftermath, stories passed down through generations, warping with each retelling, until only the structure remained: warning, water, vessel, survival, rebirth. But the Sumerian version carries a detail the others lack. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. Not that humans rebuilt on their own. Not that survivors slowly reformed society. The tablets insist that the post-flood world received the same gift the pre-flood world had: kingship lowered from above, civilization transferred rather than invented. If the king list is mythology, it is mythology with a disturbingly consistent internal logic. If it is history describing a world where rulers were something other than human, where time moved differently, where knowledge came from outside rather than within. The clay makes no distinction between the mythical and the factual. It records both with the same business-like precision, as if no difference existed. And perhaps to those who pressed the stylus into wet clay 5,000 years ago, there was no difference. Perhaps they were simply preserving what they had been told, what their ancestors had been told, stretching back through the mists of deep time to an age when the world was young and kingship walked down from the sky. If the king list preserves memory instead of myth, what kind of beings ruled before the flood? And why did their reign end so suddenly? The answer to what ruled before the flood lies not in tablets but in soil. When scientists excavate ancient cities, they dig through time in reverse. Each layer represents a moment frozen: a building collapsed, a street abandoned, ash from a fire that burned 3,000 years ago. In most ancient sites, you reach virgin soil after a few meters. The settlement had a beginning. But in Mesopotamia, the digging never seems to end. At Eridu, the city the king lists names as the seat of the first antediluvian king, excavators uncovered 18 separate construction levels beneath the ruins of the earliest Sumerian temples. 18 times the city had been rebuilt on top of its own rubble. The lowest temple, dated to around 5400 BC, sat more than 1,000 years before Sumer as we know it existed. Beneath that temple, beneath the carefully laid mud brick and the foundation offerings of fish bones left for the god Enki, lay something older, still a layer of silt. Then beneath the silt, traces of an earlier settlement. Its architecture cruder, but its layout strangely deliberate, as if whoever built it understood principles of urban design that should not yet have been conceived. At Uruk, German scientists peeled back the remains of the Great Ziggurat and found the city descending in layers like a stone dropped into still water, each triple a previous version. Uruk 4, Uruk 5, Uruk 6 numbering systems that became absurd as the levels multiplied. At the deepest excavated layers, around 4000 BC, they found buildings constructed with a sophistication that seemed to have no precedent, no learning curve. At Kish, the excavation team led by Stephen Langton in the 1920s, dug through flood silt and found beneath it a pre-Sumerian occupation layer with tools that should not have existed, yet copper implements in an age when stone should have still dominated, pottery kilns fired at temperatures requiring knowledge of controlled combustion. The deeper they dug, the less the progression made sense. Civilization is supposed to evolve. Mud huts become mud brick houses. Stone tools become copper. Copper becomes bronze. Simple villages grow into towns, towns into cities. There should be a visible gradient, a path from crude to refined. But in southern Mesopotamia, the gradient runs backward. The oldest layers show signs of knowledge that later periods seem to have forgotten, then slowly relearned. In some sites, excavators found something more disturbing: vitrified soil, patches of earth turned to glass by temperatures far exceeding any natural fire or ancient kiln. In the 1940s, scientist Sir Leonard Woolley noted such areas in the deepest layers of Earth, but attributed them to unknown causes, a phrase scientists use when evidence defies comfortable explanation. Vitrification requires sustained heat above 1,400 degrees centigrade, hotter than Bronze Age technology should produce, hotter than any accidental fire could maintain. Modern researchers have proposed lightning strikes, but the affected areas are too large, too distributed. The glass sits in layers, suggesting repeated exposure. Something scorched the earth before Sumer rose. But the greatest mystery lay not in what was found, but in who left it there. The Ubaid culture, named after the tell where its artifacts were first identified, occupied southern Mesopotamia from roughly 6500 to 3800 BC, nearly 3 millennia before the first Sumerian dynasties. There were farmers, fishermen, and builders who constructed the foundation upon which Sumer would later rise. They created irrigation canals, fired pottery, and established permanent settlements at sites that would become Eridu and Uruk. Yet we know almost nothing about them. They left no written language, no king lists, no names. Only their pottery remains, distinctive geometric patterns in green and black, and their figurines. The figurines are what scientists cannot explain. Thousands have been recovered from Ubaid sites, crafted with care from clay and baked hard. They depict humanoid figures, but the proportions are wrong. The heads are elongated, rising to strange peaks. The faces are reptilian, slitted eyes, no nose, a mouth that seems lipless. Some hold infants with the same features. Others stand in postures suggesting authority or ritual. In museums, they're labeled ritual objects or fertility figures, catch-all terms, meaning we don't know. But the consistency across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers suggests these were not abstract art. They were representations of something the Ubaid people saw, or remembered, or worshipped. Some researchers propose cranial binding, the practice of wrapping infant skulls to create elongated shapes. But the Ubaid figurines predate evidence of this practice in Mesopotamia by thousands of years. And cranial binding does not explain the reptilian features, the slit eyes, the absence of human characteristics. The figurines depict something but not us. What makes the Ubaid culture even stranger is their urban planning. At Eridu, the earliest temple is not a primitive structure built by trial and error. It sits on a precise north-south axis, aligned with cardinal directions in ways that require sustained astronomical observation. The layout suggests knowledge of geometry and celestial mechanics. Other Ubaid settlements show similar orientations. Temples face specific stars. Buildings align with solar and lunar events. The arrangement is too consistent to be accidental, too sophisticated to be coincidental. They knew the sky. They planned their cities according to patterns written in constellations. And then, around 3800 BC, they vanished from the archaeological record, or rather, they transformed into something we call Sumerian, though the connection is murky, the transition unexplained. Did the Sumerians conquer the Ubaid, absorb them, inherit their cities, and continue their work? Or were the Sumerians simply the next version, the survivors who rebuilt on top of the ruins of a world the flood had partially erased? At Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia, scientists uncovered a mass grave from around 3800 BC containing hundreds of bodies, buried hastily without ceremony. Analysis of the remains showed signs of violent trauma. Around the same time, many Ubaid settlements were abandoned rapidly, leaving tools and pottery in place, as if the inhabitants fled without time to gather their belongings. Something ended the Ubaid world suddenly. And when Sumer emerged a few centuries later, it emerged not as a primitive culture groping towards civilization, but as a society already in possession of advanced knowledge: writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, as if the knowledge had been waiting beneath the ground, preserved in the memory of survivors who rebuilt what they half-remembered. In the 1980s, scientist Juris Ahrens proposed that the Persian Gulf basin, now submerged under shallow seas, had once been a fertile river valley, the confluence of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karen, and Wadi Batin rivers. According to his research, this valley remained dry and habitable until around 6000 BC, when rising sea levels from post-ice age melting began flooding the basin. By 4000 BC, the entire valley had vanished beneath the waves. The settlements existed in that valley, and why wouldn't they, given the fertility in fresh water that an entire civilization could have drowned with no trace beyond the stories passed down by those who fled to higher ground. Those refugees would have arrived in the uplands carrying fragmented memories of a lost world, great cities swallowed by water, knowledge preserved by a chosen few, a catastrophic reset that divided time into before and after. They would have arrived with stories of elongated kings who ruled for ages. They would have arrived with star maps and mathematics they could no longer fully explain. They would have arrived claiming that kingship civilization itself had once descended from heaven, and after the flood, descended again. The archaeological layers confirm it. Beneath every Sumerian city lies something older. Beneath the oldest layers lies flood silt. And beneath the flood silt lies evidence of a civilization destroyed, its achievements buried, its people scattered, its memory preserved only in the distorted myths of those who survived. The Sumerians were not the first. They were the inheritors. But then scientists uncovered something stranger, records that spoke not of what lay beneath the ground, but what came from above. Why do the earliest Sumerian tablets insist that knowledge came down from heaven rather than up from human progress? The phrase appears over and over, carved into clay across centuries, repeated with the precision of liturgy. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven. Not metaphor, not poetry, a statement of fact delivered with the same businesslike tone used to record temple rations or boundary disputes. The Sumerian scribes who copied these texts treated the descent of kingship as a historical event, something that happened, not something imagined. In Sumerian thought, heaven was not the empty void above the clouds. It was the realm of cosmic order, the dimension where divine beings enacted the principles that governed existence below. Earth Kai was the reflection, the place where celestial law became physical reality. Between them lay no impossible barrier. The gods moved between realms as naturally as humans crossed rivers. And when they descended, they brought structure with them. The Anunnaki, whose name means those who from heaven to earth came, were not distant, abstract deities. They were involved, active. They convened councils to decide the fate of cities. They judged disputes between kings. They divided the elements of civilization among themselves like administrators assigning departments. Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, received control over the Abzu, the underground ocean of sweet water from which all life emerged. He was the craftsman, the engineer, the keeper of sacred knowledge. Tablets describe him as the one who set things in order, who established the principles of mathematics, irrigation, and metalworking. His temple at Eridu, the oldest cult center in Sumer, was said to rest directly above the Abzu, the point where divine knowledge flowed into the world of men. Enlil, lord of wind and storm, held authority over Lil, the breath, the atmosphere, the space between heaven and earth. He was the executive, the one who made divine will manifest. His city, Nippur, served as the religious center of all Sumer. Kings did not rule legitimately unless Enlil's temple acknowledged their authority. His word was law. His judgment absolute. Inanna, goddess of love and war, embodied the paradox of civilization itself, creation and destruction intertwined. She descended to the underworld and returned transformed, bringing with her knowledge of death and rebirth. Our hymns describe her as the one who makes order from chaos, who holds the mead the divine principles and gives them out according to her will. These were not gods to be feared from afar. They were gods who walked the earth, who built the first temples with their own hands, who taught humanity the arts of civilization before withdrawing to their celestial realm and ruling through chosen intermediaries. The clearest description of their relationship with humanity comes from the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest complete narratives in human literature, written in Akkadian, but preserving Sumerian traditions far more ancient. The story begins not with humanity but with exhaustion. For 40 years, the lesser gods, the Igigi, labored to dig the great rivers, to shape the earth according to the Anunnaki's design. They hauled soil, dredged channels, built the irrigation works that would make Mesopotamia fertile. And after 40 years, they rebelled. They burned their tools, surrounded Enlil's house, and demanded relief from their endless toil. The great gods convened. Enlil wanted to punish the rebels. But Enki proposed a different solution: create workers to bear the burden. Not gods, but beings close enough to understand instruction, smart enough to labor efficiently, but limited enough to remain obedient. The method Enki describes is disturbingly specific. Slaughter one god. Let the gods be cleansed by immersion. With his flesh and blood, let into mixed clay. Let God and man be mixed together in clay. The text does not speak in vague mythological terms. It describes a procedure. Nintu, the birth goddess, takes the clay, the raw material, and mixes it with divine blood. 7 male and 7 female vessels are prepared. The mixture is divided. Incantations are spoken. And from the clay emerges Lulu, the primitive worker, the first human. For 3,000 years, scholars read this as creation mythology, symbolic of humanity's divine spark. But the language resists symbolism. It reads like instruction, like a recipe, like the careful notation of a process that must be followed precisely to achieve the desired result. Mesopotamian medicine texts use similar step-by-step language: mix these ingredients, apply heat, shape the mixture, speak the proper words. The Atrahasis account follows the same structure. It describes genetic engineering in the vocabulary available to Bronze Age scribes. Humanity, in the oldest written account of our origin, was designed, built to specification, crafted for a purpose. And the purpose was labor. Yet humanity was also given something the Igigi never had: the me. The me are one of the strangest concepts in Sumerian religion. They are not abstract principles or moral guidelines. They are physical objects, tablets, tools, symbols that embody the fundamental aspects of civilization. Kingship is a me. Writing is a me. Music, law, metalwork, weaving, priesthood, warfare, each a discrete element that can be possessed, transferred, or stolen. In the myth Inanna and Enki, the goddess travels to Eridu and plies Enki with beer until, drunk and generous, he gives her over 100 me. She loads them onto her boat and flees to her own city, Uruk, while Lenki, sobering up, sends demons to retrieve them. She escapes, and Uruk becomes great because it possesses the me. The story is told as myth, but it describes something else: knowledge transfer. Civilization did not evolve in Uruk. It was imported, brought from Eridu, the oldest city, the place where divine knowledge first touched earth. Mathematics arrived the same way. The BASC 60 system the Sumerians used, still present in our 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours, appears fully formed in the earliest tablets. No simple accounting system precedes it. No gradual evolution from base 10 or base 12. The system emerges complete, capable of handling fractions, geometry, and astronomical calculations from its first appearance. Astronomical knowledge follows the same pattern. The Molopin tablets list planetary movements, eclipse cycles, and star positions with precision that should require centuries of observation. Yet the earliest references to this knowledge appear already complete, as if the Sumerians inherited star charts rather than compiled them. The tablets themselves suggest this. A number of astronomical texts include the phrase, according to the old writings, or as the ancients knew, implying sources even older than Sumer knowledge preserved from an earlier age. Meanwhile, across the world, other cultures tell the same story with different names. In Egypt, the god Thoth descended from the heavens to teach writing, mathematics, and astronomy. He gave humanity the calendar, the measurement of time, the sacred texts that would preserve divine knowledge through the ages. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, descended from the sky to teach the Maya and Aztec people agriculture, architecture, and the calendar systems that track celestial cycles with stunning accuracy. In Hebrew tradition, the Book of Enoch describes the Watchers angels who descended to earth and taught humanity forbidden knowledge: metalworking, cosmetics, weaponry, and the secrets of the heavens. In the Vedic texts of India, the Rishis, divine sages, descended from higher realms to transmit the knowledge of the cosmos to chosen humans, who preserved it in hymns passed down through millennia. The pattern repeats with uncanny consistency: beings descend, knowledge transfers, civilization emerges not through gradual discovery, but through sudden gift. Modern anthropology calls this mythology humanity's attempt to explain the mystery of its own advancement by attributing it to divine intervention. But mythology is not necessarily false memory. It can be garbled history, truth distorted through countless retellings until only the structure remains. Cultural memory operates differently than written history. It preserves patterns rather than details. The faces of the gods change. The names shift. The specific events blur. But the core narrative endures. We were given this. We did not invent it. We are inheritors of knowledge from a source we no longer fully understand. The Sumerians wrote in a language already ancient. They built on top of ruins already forgotten. They recorded star positions observed by ancestors whose names have vanished. And they attributed all of it: kingship, writing, law, mathematics, to a descent from heaven. Either they were wrong, and civilization arose naturally through human ingenuity despite every text claiming otherwise. Or they were right, and the deepest mystery is not that knowledge descended, but why those who gave it eventually withdrew. If this knowledge was truly given, not discovered, then what language did these early people inherit, and where did it come from? Languages evolve. They borrow from neighbors, shift over generations, leave traces of their ancestry in grammar and vocabulary. Latin becomes Italian, Spanish, French. Proto-Indo-European branches into Sanskrit, Greek, Germanic, Celtic. Even isolated languages show some internal development, archaic forms giving way to classical to everyday speech. Sumerian does none of this. It appears in the archaeological record around 3200 BC, already fully functional, already capable of expressing complex legal concepts, religious philosophy, and administrative details. And it has no relatives. No parent language from which it descended. No sister languages with which it shares roots. No daughter languages that inherited its structure after it died. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no demonstrated relationship to any other known language family. Isolates exist. Basque in Europe. Ainu in Japan. Burushaski in Pakistan. But these are spoken languages that survived in geographic isolation, their origins lost to time, but their existence explainable through separation. Sumerian is different. It did not survive in isolation. It thrived at the crossroads of the ancient world, in constant contact with Akkadian, Elamite, and other Semitic languages. And yet it remained linguistically impenetrable, sharing almost no vocabulary or grammar with any of them despite millennia of coexistence. When Akkadian speakers conquered Sumer around 2334 BC, they did not replace Sumerian. They preserved it. For another 2,000 years, Sumerian remained the language of religion, law, and scholarship, even though no one spoke it natively anymore. Scribes learned it the way medieval Europeans learned Latin, as a sacred tongue, the language in which truth had first been written. But here is what disturbs linguists: when those Akkadian scribes learned Sumerian, they used textbooks, clay tablets inscribed with vocabulary lists, grammar exercises, and translation guides. These teaching tablets, found by the thousands at sites like Nippur, reveal something troubling: the Sumerian they were learning was already archaic. The textbooks include notes like Old Form and is spoken in ancient times, indicating that even by 2000 BC, when Sumerian was still being actively studied, scholars recognized they were learning a language that had frozen centuries earlier. Some tablets include multiple dialectal forms, suggesting regional variations that had already frozen into historical artifacts. It was as if Sumerian had been old from the moment it was written down. The structure of the language defies easy categorization. It is agglutinative, building meaning by stacking morphemes' smallest units of meaning into long, complex chains. A single Sumerian word can contain a subject, verb, object, and multiple modifiers, compressed into a sequence that operates more like a mathematical equation than a sentence. For example, a Galanida, which breaks down as Haspijin Hisfram, meaning from his palace. Each element carries precise grammatical weight, and the order is fixed by rules that have no parallel in Semitic, Indo-European, or any other major language family. Verbal chains are even more complex. Sumerian verbs encode not just tense and aspect, but spatial orientation, direction of action, beneficiary, and intentionality all in a single word. The verb to give has different forms, depending on whether the giving moves upward, downward, toward the speaker, away from the speaker, or involves reciprocal exchange. This is not a language that developed organically through trial and error. It is a language engineered for precision, designed to eliminate ambiguity even at the cost of simplicity. Dr. Gonzalo Rubio, one of the foremost Sumerian linguists, noted in his research that Sumerian's grammatical complexity appears frozen rather than evolutionary. Unlike languages that show gradual simplification or elaboration over time, Sumerian's earliest examples are grammatically identical to its latest. The language did not change. It was maintained. And yet, when scientists examine the very earliest writing from Europe protocuneiform tablets dating to 3400 BC, they find something impossible to reconcile with linguistic evolution. The script already exists, but the language behind it is unclear. Some signs represent objects: grain, cattle, beer. Others represent sounds or concepts that don't map neatly onto any known language. Attempts to read protocuneiform as Sumerian partially work, but many tablets resist translation, suggesting the script was adapted from an even earlier system designed for a different language entirely. French scientist Jean-Jacques Glasner proposed that protocuneiform was a prelinguistic notation system, a way to record information without committing to a specific spoken language. But if true, this raises a darker question: if the script came first, and Sumerian was imposed onto it later, where did Sumerian itself come from? Some tablets from the early dynastic period include word lists that seem to preserve fragments of an even older vocabulary, terms for tools, plants, and ritual objects that have no Sumerian etymology. These words function within Sumerian grammar, but feel imported, like loan words from a language that no longer exists. Linguist Arno Pobel identified several such terms in the 1930s, and called them substrate vocabulary remnants of a pre-Sumerian language, spoken by the original inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia. But if a pre-Sumerian language existed, why does it leave no other trace? Why does Sumerian, which supposedly replaced it, show no signs of gradual borrowing or creolization? Unless Sumerian did not replace the earlier language. Unless it was the earlier language, preserved in written form long after its speakers vanished. The tablets themselves hint at this. Sumerian hymns frequently describe language as a divine gift, something bestowed rather than developed. The goddess Nisaba, patron of writing and grain, is called she who knows the inmost secrets of numbers, who teaches the measuring rod. Language, in Sumerian theology, was not human invention. It was sacred technology, given by the gods to organize the world. One hymn Tenki describes him as he who directs the words of the great gods, the one who makes the tongue of Sumer resplendent. Not who invented language, but who directed it, who made it resplendent, implying the language already existed and needed only to be shaped, clarified, set into its final form. Another text, the Sumerian composition Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, tells of a time when the whole universe, the people in unison, spoke to Enlil in one tongue. Then, after a divine conflict, the goddess Ninhursag changed the speech in their mouths, creating the multitude of languages. The story echoes the Tower of Babel, but with a critical difference: the original unified language was Sumerian, and its fragmentation was divine punishment. The implication is clear: Sumerian was the first language, the original tongue, the one spoken before confusion scattered humanity into linguistic chaos. Modern scholarship dismisses this as mythology. But mythology often preserves distorted truth. If a catastrophic event, flood, war, climate collapse, destroyed an earlier civilization, the survivors would carry fragments of that civilization's language into their new world. Over generations, the language would be remembered as ancient, sacred, given by the gods, because its origins would recede beyond living memory. Meanwhile, the writing system itself suggests antiquity beyond what archaeology has uncovered. Cuneiform wedges are not intuitive. They require training, specialized tools, and years of practice to master. Yet the earliest scribes wrote with confidence, producing thousands of tablets with standardized sign forms and consistent grammar. There is no learning phase visible in the archaeological record. No experimental stage where the system is tested and refined. The script appears as fully formed as the language it records. Some researchers have proposed that writing was invented multiple times in Mesopotamia, with earlier systems lost to flood or fire. Others suggest that Sumerian cuneiform is a simplified version of an even more complex script that has not survived. But these are speculations built on the absence of evidence for linguistic evolution, the absence of precursor languages, the absence of gradual development. What remains is a language that should not exist in the form it does, complex, isolated, frozen in time, appearing suddenly in the archaeological record with no explanation for its origin, no relatives to connect it to a broader linguistic family, and no descendants to carry its structure forward. A language preserved, not evolved. Inherited, not invented. If the Sumerians inherited a forgotten language, what else did they inherit that we no longer recognize? The flood is not metaphor. It is sediment. Across southern Mesopotamia, excavators cutting through ancient city layers encounter the same disruption as sterile band of water-laid clay, sometimes 2 meters thick, separating older settlements from newer construction above. No pottery shards, no tools, no charcoal from cooking fires, just clean silt deposited by water, moving with enough force to erase habitation entirely. Leonard Woolley found it at Ur. Stephen Langton found it at Kish. Eric Schmidt found it at far ancient Shuruppak, the city where, according to the king list, Ubertutu ruled before the deluge swept over. The flood layer does not appear uniformly across all sites, suggesting localized catastrophes rather than a single global inundation. But where it appears, it marks a boundary, the world before and the world after. The question is not whether a great flood occurred in Mesopotamia. The question is when and what it destroyed. Geologists have identified multiple candidates, each catastrophic enough to generate the myths that followed. Around 5600 BC, the Black Sea transformed from a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea, in what researchers William Ryan and Walter Pittman called a flood of biblical proportions. Their hypothesis, based on core samples and underwater surveys, suggests that rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam at the Bosphorus Strait, sending a waterfall 10 miles wide, and twice the volume of Niagara Falls cascading into the basin below. The freshwater lake rose rapidly. Estimates suggest 15 centimeters per day, submerging coastal settlements and forcing populations to flee inland. Archaeological evidence supports mass migration from the Black Sea region into Anatolia and Mesopotamia during this period. The survivors carried stories of their drowned homeland south. Those stories would have entered Sumerian cultural memory as tales of a world erased by rising water. But an earlier event matches the Sumerian chronology more precisely. The Younger Dryas period, lasting from roughly 10,800 to 9,600 BC, represents one of the most dramatic climate shifts in human history. Global temperatures plunged, returning Ice Age conditions for over a millennium. Then, suddenly, the ice melted. Massive glacial lakes larger than any body of water existing today burst through their ice dams and poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose by 120 meters over several thousand years, with catastrophic pulses occurring in relatively short spans. One such pulse, dated to around 8000 BC, coincides with geological evidence of rapid coastal flooding across the Persian Gulf basin. Juris Serins, the scientist who mapped the submerged river systems of the Gulf, demonstrated that what is now shallow sea was once a vast river valley, the confluence of 4 rivers, creating a fertile plain larger than modern Iraq. This valley, he argued, remained dry and habitable until postglacial sea level rise submerged it, forcing populations to retreat to the uplands of Mesopotamia. In 1993, Ferik Albaz used satellite imaging to trace ancient river courses beneath the Gulf's waters. The riverbeds are still visible in seafloor topography, winding through what was once dry land. The settlements existed along those rivers, and every archaeological principle suggests they would have then an entire civilization drowned, leaving no ruins to excavate, no tablets to translate, only the stories of those who escaped. Those stories became myth. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the Mesopotamian flood account in vivid detail. Utnapishtim, worn by the god Enki, builds a massive boat sealed with bitumen. He loads it with his family, craftsmen, animals, and the seed of all living things. The storm arrives, so violent that even the gods cower in fear. For 6 days and 7 nights, the waters rise. On the 7th day, the boat grounds on a mountain. Utnapishtim releases a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven does not return. The land has re-emerged. The older Atrahasis epic tells the same story with different emphasis. The gods, disturbed by humanity's noise, decide to eliminate them through flood. Enki warns Atrahasis, who builds the boat and survives. Afterward, the gods regret their decision and establish a new order. Humanity will continue, but under stricter divine oversight. The structure is consistent: divine warning, sealed vessel, rising waters, mountain refuge, bird messenger, survival, renewal. Genesis, written over a millennium after the earliest Sumerian versions, follows the same pattern. Noah, warned by God. The ark, sealed with pitch. 40 days and nights of rain. Mount Ararat. The dove and the raven. The covenant establishing a new order. Even the dimensions of the vessels are similar when converted from cubits to Mesopotamian measures. The story predates Abraham, predates Moses, predates the Hebrew people themselves. It is Sumerian, inherited by the Akkadians, passed to the Babylonians, carried into Canaanite tradition, and eventually inscribed in the Torah, as if it were original revelation. But the flood myth extends far beyond the Near East. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, warned by a great fish and avatar of Vishnu to build a boat before the waters destroyed the world. He saves himself, the 7 sages, and seeds of all life. In Greece, Deucalion Emperor survives Zeus's flood in a wooden chest, landing on Mount Parnassus, then repopulate the earth by throwing stones that become people. Among the Mapuche of South America, the serpent Kaikai raises the ocean to destroy humanity, while the serpent Trenturan raises the mountains to save the faithful. The Ojibwe of North America remember Nanabazo, who survives a world flood by creating a raft and later dives to retrieve mud from the drowned earth to rebuild land. Over 200 cultures preserve flood traditions. The details vary: the cause, the survivors, the gods involved, but the core remains: water rises, the old world drowns, a remnant escapes, and from that remnant, civilization begins again. Anthropologists have long debated whether these myths reflect actual events or archetypal human fears. But geology increasingly supports the former. Catastrophic flooding occurred. Coastlines vanished. Populations migrated. And those who survived carried memories of what was lost. The Sumerians, however, added a detail the other cultures lack: after the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more. Not that survivors rebuilt on their own. Not that civilization slowly re-emerged through human effort. The tablets insist on divine intervention, a second transfer of knowledge, a reboot initiated from above. The king list divides history cleanly: 8 kings before the flood, dynasties after. The antediluvian rulers are listed with impossible reigns, suggesting they were not human in the conventional sense. The post-flood kings have more reasonable lifespans, still long, still semi-divine, but measurable in human terms. It is as if the flood did not just destroy cities. It destroyed a form of kingship, a type of ruler, a relationship between heaven and earth that had to be reconstituted. The text describes this reconstitution with precision. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Not Eridu, the antediluvian capital. Kish, a new city, a new beginning, a new dispensation. Civilization did not continue. It restarted. And the restart required the same divine intervention that initiated the first age. This is not how cultures typically describe historical continuity. Civilizations conquered by enemies claim resilience, survival, eventual triumph. Civilizations devastated by natural disasters emphasize recovery, reconstruction, human perseverance. But the Sumerians describe dependency. They survived the flood, but they did not rebuild alone. They acquired kingship to descend again. They acquired Demi to be redistributed. They acquired divine beings to re-establish order, to teach once more what had been forgotten in the deluge. It is the language of inheritance from a broken line. The language of survivors who remember fragments but not the whole. The language of people who know they are rebuilding something that once existed in a form they can no longer fully comprehend. The flood, in Sumerian memory, was not just destruction. It was a reset, a wiping that erased the old world so completely that even the survivors became dependent on outside knowledge to restore what they had lost. And buried in that dependency is the deepest mystery: if humanity required divine intervention to rebuild after the flood, what had humanity been before the flood that it could not rebuild on its own? If the flood erased a previous world, what traces of those who lived before still remain beneath the ziggurats? In 1929, Leonard Woolley's excavation team at the Royal Cemetery of Ur uncovered something that did not fit the burial patterns they had come to expect. Among the graves of kings and queens, beneath layers of lapis lazuli and golden artifacts, they found skeletal remains with unusual cranial shape. The skulls were elongated dramatically, so rising to pronounce peaks that seemed inconsistent with normal human anatomy. Woolley's initial notes, archived at the British Museum but rarely referenced in his published works, describe the finds with cautious language. He writes of atypical cranial formations and unusual skeletal proportions in individuals buried in the deepest, oldest layers. Some of the elongation, he noted, appeared consistent with cranial binding, the practice of wrapping infants' heads to achieve desired shapes. But others showed what he termed internal structural elongation. Internal elongation is different. Cranial binding deforms the outer skull by applying pressure during infancy when the bones are still soft. The result is cosmetic: the shape changes, but the internal volume, suture patterns, and bone thickness remain within normal human parameters. But some of the skulls from Ur showed increased cranial capacity, fused sutures in atypical locations, and bone density variations that binding does not produce. Woolley labeled them ritual deformation of unknown technique and moved on. The bones were catalogued, photographed, then quietly shipped to storage in London, where they remain today, rarely studied, seldom mentioned. At Kish, excavated by Stephen Langdon and Ernest Mackay between 1923 and 1933, similar anomalies appeared. A tomb in the lowest occupation layer, dated to roughly 3100 BC, contained a skeleton with pronounced dolichocephalic features and elongated skull, measuring significantly longer than the human average, with the cranial index placing it outside the normal range of variation. Mackay's field notes, held at Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, include sketches of the skull from multiple angles. He notes difficulty in classification, and uncertain whether result of binding or natural formation. A notation in the margin, added later, reads recommend further analysis. Anatomical features inconsistent with known binding practices. That further analysis never occurred, or if it did, the results were never published. The bones presented a problem. If the elongation was natural, it suggested a population with cranial morphology distinct from Homo sapiens sapiens. If it was artificial, it raised questions about why such practices would appear in the deepest, oldest layers, before, according to the conventional timeline, such traditions should have existed in Mesopotamia. The easiest solution was to label them anomalies and move forward. But the anomalies appeared elsewhere, in contexts that made dismissal more difficult. In Egypt, elongated skulls have been found in royal burials at Amarna, Saqqara, and Abydos. The most famous is Akhenaten's. His statues depict him with an unnaturally elongated head, narrow shoulders, and feminized features. Some scholars attribute this to artistic style, the Amarna art revolution that reimagined royal portraiture. Others suggest Akhenaten suffered from Marfan syndrome or another genetic disorder. But no genetic disorder produces the specific cranial shape depicted in his sculptures. And when his probable remains were analyzed, they showed skeletal anomalies that remain unexplained. His daughters, shown in reliefs with similarly elongated skulls, suggest a hereditary trait rather than individual pathology. In Peru, the Paracas culture produced elongated skulls so dramatic that when they were first studied in the 1920s, researchers assumed they were examples of extreme cranial binding. But detailed analysis by physical anthropologists revealed something troubling. Some Paracas skulls have 25% greater cranial volume than average human skulls, with only one parietal plate instead of two, and occipital foramina positioned differently than in any known human population. Cranial binding does not increase internal volume. It redistributes the shape of existing bone. The Paracas skull suggests something else, either a genetic variation, a distinct population, or evidence of skeletal traits no longer present in modern humans. DNA analysis conducted in 2014 by Paracas Skull Research Project Director Brian Forster yielded results that complicated rather than clarified. Mitochondrial DNA showed haplogroups consistent with Native American ancestry, but nuclear DNA fragments contained sequences that did not match any known human haplogroup. The findings were preliminary, contested, and require replication, but they reopened questions about whether elongated skulls represent purely cultural practices or something more biologically complex. Back in Mesopotamia, similar questions linger unanswered. The Ubaid figurines, those strange clay representations with elongated heads and reptilian features, predate any evidence of cranial binding traditions in the region by thousands of years. If they depict an idealized form, what inspired that ideal? If they represent ritual figures, why the consistency across vast distances and long time periods? Some researchers have proposed that the figurines depict a ruling class of priestly elite or shamanic practitioners who achieved altered states and were remembered as different. But the features are too specific, too anatomically detailed to be mere symbolic representation. The elongated heads, the large eyes, the narrow faces, these are not abstractions. They are portraits. In the 1940s, scientist Sir Max Mallowan, husband of Agatha Christie, excavated Tel Brak in northern Syria and uncovered a temple dating to 3500 BC, containing thousands of small alabaster figurines with enormous eyes. The Eye Temple, as it became known, raised questions about who or what these figures represented. The eyes dominate the faces far larger than human proportions allow. Mallowan described them as votive offerings. But to whom? And why this specific unsettling morphology? At Eridu, in the deepest temple levels beneath the ziggurat, excavators found skeletal remains exhibiting unusual robustness, large earthen-average bone density, pronounced muscle attachment points, and skeletal proportions, suggesting individuals of significantly greater height and physical power than typical Mesopotamian populations. These remains were noted in field reports, but never subjected to comprehensive osteological analysis. They exist in storage, catalogued but unstudied. Their existence acknowledged in footnotes but absent from mainstream archaeological narratives. Why? Because anomalies challenge timelines. They complicate narratives. They open doors to questions that academic archaeology is not equipped to answer within its current paradigm. The human evolutionary timeline is well-established: Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, archaic Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans emerging around 200,000 years ago, behavioral modernity developing around 50,000 years ago. The framework is clean, supported by fossil evidence, genetic analysis, and stratigraphic dating. Skeletal anomalies in Mesopotamia's deepest layers threaten that cleanliness. If populations with distinct cranial morphology existed in southern Mesopotamia before 3000 BC, where do they fit in the timeline? Are they variants of Homo sapiens, a relic population, evidence of interbreeding with archaic human species that survived longer than currently believed? Or, and this is the question whispered, but rarely written, are they evidence that the Sumerian texts were not entirely mythological, when they described rulers who were not entirely human? The academic response has been to avoid the question entirely. Anomalous skeletons are noted, photographed, stored, and forgotten. Museum archives contain thousands of such finds, labeled unusual or atypical, filed away in climatic-controlled storage, where they remain inaccessible to researchers who might ask uncomfortable questions. The bones do not fit the narrative. So the narrative ignores the bones. But the bones endure. Clay crumbles, cities fall, empires vanish, but bone, properly preserved, lasts millennia. And the bones from Ur, Kish, Eridu, and Shuruppak tell a story that contradicts the one written in textbooks. They suggest that in the deepest layers of Mesopotamian civilization, beneath the cities the Sumerians built, there existed populations whose physical characteristics do not align with what we expect human anatomy to be. Whether these were genetic outliers, isolated populations with rare hereditary traits, or evidence of something else entirely, the fact remains the bones were found, documented, and then quietly removed from public discussion. Not destroyed, not lost, removed. Placed in archives where they can be neither examined nor refuted. Acknowledged in specialist literature but absent from popular archaeology. Present in the record but invisible in the narrative. And this raises the most troubling question of all: if physical evidence that challenges the timeline is hidden, what other evidence has been buried not in soil, but in silence? If the bones were hidden, what else was buried? And why were certain tablets never meant to be read again? In 1849, British scientist Austin Henry Layard began excavating the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient capital of Assyria, on the eastern bank of the Tigris River. Beneath the mound of Kyanjik, he uncovered the remains of a palace so vast it took years to map. But the true treasure lay not in gold or sculpture. It lay in clay. Room after room filled with tablets. Tens of thousands of them, stacked on shelves, stored in jars, organized with the precision of a modern archive. This was the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, who in the 7th century BC had ordered scribes to collect and copy every significant text in Mesopotamia: medical treatises, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, prayers, omens, myths, histories, everything worth preserving. The tablets were shipped to the British Museum by the cartload. Over 30,000 fragments arrived in London, where they were catalogued, stored, and very slowly translated. When George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working in the museum's basement, deciphered the flood account from the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872, the discovery made international headlines. It was proof that the biblical flood predated Genesis, that the story of Noah was inherited from older Mesopotamian sources. Victorian England, whose faith rested on the uniqueness of scripture, was shaken. But the flood tablet was only the beginning. As Smith and his colleagues worked through Ashurbanipal's collection, they encountered texts that disturbed them far more than a pre-biblical flood story. Creation accounts that described humanity's origins in terms unsettlingly biological. Cosmological texts that implied knowledge of planetary movements invisible to the naked eye. References to beings who predated the flood and whose nature defied comfortable categorization. Some of these texts were translated and published. Others were noted in internal catalogs but withheld from public release. A few were marked with notations like unsuitable for general circulation or theological content requiring further review. The Victorian translators were not censoring out of malice. They were operating within a paradigm where certain ideas were literally unthinkable. The Bible was still considered historically accurate. Human history began in 4004 BC, according to Archbishop Usser's chronology. Non-European civilizations were assumed inferior. And anything that contradicted these assumptions was either symbolic, corrupted, or misunderstood. The Atrahasis epic, one of the texts Smith translated, contained the procedural description of human creation: divine blood mixed with clay in 7 vessels, incantations spoken, being shaped for labor. The language was too specific to be dismissed as poetic allegory, but too disturbing to present without extensive reinterpretation. Smith's published translation emphasized the mythological aspects, while downplaying the procedural details. He framed the creation as primitive theological speculation, a culture's attempt to explain existence through supernatural metaphor. The original text's clinical tone, its step-by-step instructions, its emphasis on method and material, was softened in translation, rendered mythological rather than descriptive. Other tablets received harsher treatment. Several fragments from Ashurbanipal's library reference the Anunnaki in contexts that Victorian scholars found theologically problematic. One tablet, catalogued as K3657, describes the Anunnaki as those who descended to Earth from the bright sky, and lists their functions: judges, overseers, builders of cities, teachers of sacred knowledge. The text does not describe them as metaphorical forces or abstract deities. It describes them as physical beings who move between realms and interacted directly with humanity. The tablet was translated, catalogued, and filed. It appears in academic indexes, but has never been fully published in accessible form. Researchers can request access, but few do. The tablet exists in a liminal space acknowledged but unexplored, present but invisible. Another series of tablets, designated the Enuma Annual, contains astronomical observations spanning centuries. These texts list planetary positions, eclipse cycles, and star catalogs with precision that should not exist in the 7th century BC, much less in the earlier periods from which Ashurbanipal scribes copied them. The tablets record Venus's synodic period, the time it takes to return to the same position, relative to the Sun, as 584 days. The actual value is 583.92 days. The margin of error is less than 0.02%. Similar precision appears in calculations of Jupiter's orbital period, Saturn's cycle, and lunar eclipse predictions. When these tablets were first studied in the early 20th century, astronomers assumed the observations must be contemporaneous, recorded during Ashurbanipal's reign by skilled Babylonian astronomers. But the tablets include the phrase "according to the old writings," indicating they were copies of much older sources. Some texts reference observations from before the flood, during the reigns of antediluvian kings, suggesting astronomical records stretching back thousands of years. Modern scholarship has largely dismissed these references as mythological framing. But the mathematical accuracy of the data complicates dismissal. How does a Bronze Age civilization inherit star charts accurate to within fractions of a percent? The answer implied by the tablets themselves, that the knowledge was preserved from an earlier age, is archaeologically uncomfortable. It suggests continuity of astronomical observation across a period when, according to the standard timeline, such observation should not have been possible. Several tablets describe what 19th century translators called antediluvian sciences knowledge, possessed by pre-flood civilizations. These include references to metalwork techniques, agricultural methods, architectural principles, and medical practices attributed to beings who lived before the deluge. One fragment, K2100, describes a race of beings called the Apkallu sages, sent by the god Enki, to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The text states there were 7 Apkallu before the flood, each associated with a city, each credited with specific knowledge. Adap of Eridu, who taught writing. Uana, who brought the meat from heaven. Ons, who taught agriculture and law. Later Mesopotamian kings claimed descent from these antediluvian sages, invoking their names in rituals designed to access forgotten wisdom. The Apkallu were not gods. There were intermediaries, hybrid beings described as part human, part divine, who walked the earth in physical form before the flood erased them. Victorian translators read these accounts and labeled them mythology. But the texts themselves resist mythological interpretation. They name specific individuals, assign them to specific cities, credit them with specific inventions, and place them in a chronological framework that treats them as historical. The problem is that acknowledging them as historical requires accepting that pre-flood Mesopotamia possessed advanced knowledge, was guided by non-human intelligences, and was deliberately erased by catastrophe claims that 19th century archaeology could not accommodate. So the tablets were translated selectively, published partially, interpreted carefully. And the most problematic passages were footnoted, filed, and forgotten. In the decades following Smith's work, access to Ashurbanipal's library became increasingly restricted. Tablets were dispersed among institutions. Some remained in the British Museum's basement, inaccessible without specific permissions. Others were sent to universities, where they languished untranslated. A few disappeared entirely, their catalog numbers still listed, but their physical location unknown. The 20th century brought new complications. During the Iraq War of 2003, the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad was looted. Thousands of artifacts vanished, including Mesopotamian tablets that had never been fully catalogued or translated. Some were recovered. Many were not. Among the losses were tablets from Ashurbanipal's library that had been returned to Iraq in the 1920s. What knowledge those tablets contained is now unknowable. They exist only as catalog entries, brief descriptions in outdated ledgers, fragments of translations that hint at content now lost. In 2015, ISIS militants destroyed portions of the Mosul Museum and bulldozed the archaeological site of Nimrud. Among the casualties were clay tablets dating to the Neo-Assyrian period, contemporaneous with Ashurbanipal's library, and likely containing similar content. Video footage shows militants smashing display cases and pulverizing tablets beneath hammers, erasing in minutes what had survived millennia. The destroyed tablets had not been digitized. Their content is gone. Whether this destruction was ideological, an attempt to erase pre-Islamic history, or opportunistic looting disguised as iconoclasm, the result is the same texts that might have illuminated Mesopotamia's understanding of its own past are now dust. And this raises a question more troubling than accidental loss: how much of the suppression has been deliberate? Not just the recent destruction, but the century of selective translation, restricted access, and institutional indifference that preceded it. How many tablets sit untranslated in museum basements because their content is too strange, too challenging, too incompatible with established narratives? The tablets that describe human creation as genetic engineering. The tablets that treat the Anunnaki as physical beings rather than metaphors. The tablets that reference pre-flood civilizations possessing advanced knowledge. The tablets that describe humanity not as the pinnacle of creation, but as a designed species, crafted for purpose, then left to inherit a world not entirely its own. These tablets exist. They are catalogued. They are real. But they are not discussed, not taught, not integrated into the mainstream understanding of human history. They are forbidden not by law, but by silence. If the tablets were suppressed, what truths about early humanity were too dangerous to reveal? The cylinder seals are small, most no larger than a human thumb, but the stories they tell are enormous. These carved stone cylinders, rolled across wet clay to create impressions, served as signatures, ownership marks, and official stamps in ancient Mesopotamia. Thousands survive, depicting everything from mundane administrative scenes to elaborate mythological narratives. And within those narratives appears a pattern that repeats with unsettling consistency: towering beings, physically larger than the humans around them, holding objects that defy easy explanation. And seal after seal, these figures stand head and shoulders above ordinary people. They wear elaborate headdresses, often horned, sometimes conical, that mark them as divine or semi-divine. They hold objects in their hands: bucket-shaped containers, comb-like tools, circular devices, and wrist-mounted instruments that look disturbingly technological for a Bronze Age culture. The most common object is what researchers call the handbag, a rectangular container with a curved handle, held by figures associated with kingship, wisdom, and the transfer of knowledge. The god Enki holds it. The Akkala sages carry it. Kings receiving divine authority are shown receiving it. The official archaeological interpretation is that these represent purification buckets for ritual sprinkling. But the shape is too consistent, too carefully detailed, and too frequently associated with knowledge transfer to be mere ceremonial equipment. In scenes depicting the giving of the mead, the divine principles of civilization, these objects appear prominently, as if they are containers for something portable, transferable, physical. The same object appears in Mesoamerican iconography, thousands of miles and thousands of years removed from Sumer. Olmec gods carried them. Maya reliefs show them. Toltec sculptures depict them. The shape is identical: rectangular body, curved handle, held by beings associated with bringing civilization to humanity. Coincidence does not explain identical symbolism across cultures with no known contact. The figures wearing the horned helmets appear in contexts that describe instruction, judgment, and oversight. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Shamash, the sun god, wears such a headdress when he descends to guide the hero. In temple reliefs, the Anunnaki judges wear them when presiding over cosmic councils. The horns are not decorative. They signify authority, a visual marker that the wearer belongs to a class above humanity. Some seals depict figures emerging from circular or disc-shaped objects surrounded by radiating lines. In one famous seal from the Akkadian period, a tall figure stands beside what appears to be a star-sun symbol, with smaller human figures approaching in supplication. The radiant object dominates the scene, positioned above the landscape as if suspended in the sky. Modern scholars describe these as solar symbols, representations of divine radiance, stylized stars indicating heavenly origin. But the precision of the imagery suggests something more literal. The objects have structured concentric circles, radiating spokes, clearly defined edges. They are not abstract symbols. They are depictions of something the artist saw, or remembered, or were told about. And they are always associated with descent. Meanwhile, the cities themselves encode astronomical knowledge in their foundations. Eridu, the oldest city, sits on a precise north-south axis. The Temple of Enki aligns with the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, and one deeply significant to ancient cultures worldwide. The Egyptians based their calendar on Sirius's heliacal rising. The Maya tracked it obsessively. And the Dogon people of Mali possessed detailed knowledge of Sirius's binary companion, star invisible to the naked eye, and not confirmed by Western astronomy until the 20th century. The Uruk's main temple complex, dedicated to Inanna, aligns with Venus. The goddess herself was associated with the planet, and her mythology mirrors Venus's celestial behavior, descending to the underworld, inferior conjunction, disappearing from the sky, then rising again as the morning star. The temple layout reflects this cycle, oriented to capture Venus's position at key moments in its synodic period. Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, sits at a geographic location that later Mesopotamian texts call the bond of heaven and earth, a place where the celestial and terrestrial realms intersect. The city's layout forms geometric patterns echoing the constellation we call Orion, with major temples positioned to mirror the belt stars Alnitak, Alnilam, Mintaka. This same pattern appears at Giza, where the three great pyramids align with Orion's belt with remarkable precision. And at Teotihuacan in Mexico, where the Pyramid of the Sun, Pyramid of the Moon, and Temple of Quetzalcoatl mirror the same stellar configuration. 3 cultures, 3 continents, 1 constellation. The constellation that in Sumerian mythology represented the realm of the Anunnaki, in Egyptian mythology, marked the domain of Osiris, and in Mesoamerican mythology, symbolized the origin place of the gods. The probability of independent coincidence collapses under the weight of consistency. Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert, in their research on the Orion correlation theory, demonstrated that the Giza pyramids not only align with Orion's belt, but are positioned to reflect the constellation's appearance around 10,500 BC, thousands of years before the pyramids were supposedly built. Critics argued the alignment was coincidental, or the ancient Egyptians were simply stargazing. But when the same alignment appears in Sumerian temple layouts and Mesoamerican architecture, coincidence becomes pattern. The Sumerians possessed star maps of stunning accuracy. The Mulapin tablets list 66 stars and constellations, chart the path of the ecliptic, predict heliacal risings, and calculate planetary periods with precision not matched until Hellenistic Greek astronomy, 2 millennia later. The Venus tablets of the Misiduca track the planet's appearances and disappearances over 21 years, recording observations that modern astronomers have used to date Babylonian chronology. This knowledge appears fully formed in the earliest texts. There is no evidence of gradual discovery, no trial and error, no progression from crude observation to refined calculation. The astronomy is simply there, complete and accurate, as if downloaded from a source that had already performed the centuries of observation required to achieve such precision. The tablets themselves say this is exactly what happened. To me, those divine principles of civilization are described not as abstract concepts, but as physical objects that could be held, transferred, stolen, or lost. When Inanna tricks Enki into giving her the me, she loads them onto her boat. When Enki sobers and realizes what he has done, he sends servants to retrieve them, physical objects that can be transported, not metaphysical principles. The me include writing, kingship, priesthood, music, metalworking, weaving, judgment, victory, descent to the underworld, ascent from the underworld, truth, and over 100 other elements. Each is discrete, transferable, and essential to civilization. They are described as technologies. This framing civilization as something transferred rather than evolved appears across ancient cultures with remarkable consistency. In Egypt, Thoth descends from the heavens to give humanity writing, mathematics, and astronomy. The knowledge is not discovered. It is gifted. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl arrives from the sky to teach the arts of civilization, agriculture, architecture, calendar systems, and writing. He is described as tall, bearded, light-skinned, physically distinct from the people he instructs. When his work is done, he departs, promising to return. In the Vedas, the Rishis, divine sages, descend from higher realms to transmit the knowledge of the cosmos in the form of hymns. The Vedic knowledge is called Shruti, that which is heard, implying reception from an external source, rather than internal discovery. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers descend to earth and teach humanity forbidden knowledge, the secrets of metalworking, cosmetics, weaponry, astrology, and the movements of the stars. The text frames this knowledge transfer as transgression, as something humanity was not meant to receive, which provokes divine punishment in the form of the flood. The pattern is global beings descend, knowledge transfers, civilization emerges. Human progress is not depicted as gradual innovation, but as sudden gift, bestowed by entities described as physically present, technologically advanced, and deliberately instructive. The Sumerians are the most explicit. They do not hide the transfer behind allegory. Their texts state plainly: kingship descended from heaven. The Anunnaki came down. They taught the arts of civilization. They gave humanity the me. They walked among people, judged disputes, built cities. And then, at some point lost to history, they withdrew. Why? The tablets do not say. They record the descent, the gift, the establishment of order, and then a gradual fading. The gods become more distant. Kingship is delegated to humans who claim divine descent, but no longer possess divine attributes. The me remain, but their original givers are gone. What remains is memory preserved in clay, encoded in architecture, reflected in star maps that span continents and millennia. Memory of a time when civilization was not invented but transferred. When humanity was not alone in shaping its destiny. When beings from the sky walked the earth and gave us the tools to build, record, calculate, and remember. The civilization was transferred, not invented. Then what were we before the transfer? And why were we chosen? The human genome tells a story that echoes the flood myths with unsettling precision. Around 70,000 years ago, the global human population collapsed to fewer than 10,000 individuals, a genetic bottleneck so severe that all modern humans descend from this tiny remnant. The cause remains debated: the Toba supervolcanic eruption, climate catastrophe, disease. Whatever the trigger, humanity nearly went extinct. We survived. But we emerged from that bottleneck carrying something new. Between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, human cognition underwent a transformation so rapid that geneticists struggled to explain it through natural selection alone. Abstract thought, symbolic language, art, ritual burial, technological innovation, capabilities that distinguish us from every other hominid species appeared in a span evolutionarily too brief for gradual adaptation. The genetic signatures of this change cluster in regions called human-accelerated regions, hard stretches of DNA that evolved thousands of times faster than the background mutation rate. HAR1, associated with brain development, changed more in the 200,000 years since humans diverged from chimpanzees than it had in the previous 300 million years of vertebrate evolution. Something accelerated human evolution. The genome preserves the evidence, but not the cause. Meanwhile, genetic analysis of ancient Mesopotamian remains has revealed anomalies that complicate the narrative of linear human migration. Some skeletal samples from pre-Sumerian sites show mitochondrial haplogroups that do not fit neatly into known population movements. Others exhibit a chromosome marker suggesting admixture with populations whose origin remains unidentified. These are not Neanderthal or Denisovan markers, those are well characterized. These are something else, fragments of genetic heritage that appear briefly in the archaeological record, then vanish. The Sumerian texts describe humanity's creation in procedural terms: clay mixed with divine blood, shaped in 7 vessels, designed for labor. For millennia, this was read as mythology. But mythology can be distorted memory, truth compressed through time until only the structure remains. If an earlier version of humanity existed before the flood, anatomically similar but perhaps cognitively different, perhaps genetically distinct, and if that version was largely erased by catastrophe, then the survivors who rebuilt would carry fragmented memories of what came before. They would remember beings who ruled for impossible spans. They would remember knowledge that descended rather than arose. They would remember a world destroyed and a new world built on top of its ruins. And they would record these memories in the only permanent medium they possess: clay, pressed with wedge-shaped marks, baked hard, buried deep, waiting 5,000 years to speak again. The Sumerians never claimed to be the first civilization. They claimed to be the inheritors, the continuation of something older, something lost, something preserved only in the tablets they copied, the cities they rebuilt, the knowledge they could not fully explain, but faithfully transmitted. The creation myth does not say humanity invented itself. It says humanity was crafted, designed, engineered for purpose. Their king lists do not begin with human rulers. They begin with beings whose reigns defy biology. Their flood myths do not describe a random disaster. They describe a reset, a deliberate erasure, followed by a second descent of kingship from heaven. Every thread weaves back to the same forbidden truth: humanity as we know it may not be the original design, but a later version. The flood did not just destroy cities. It erased a previous version of the world, leaving only fragments: anomalous bones, suppressed tablets, elongated skulls, astronomical knowledge too advanced for its time, myths that repeat across continents with impossible consistency. The clay remembers what we have forgotten. And perhaps that is the deepest secret buried in Mesopotamian soil. We are not the beginning of this story. We are the middle. Inheritors of a world we did not build. Carriers of knowledge we did not discover. Descendants of survivors who rebuilt what the flood destroyed. The tablets do not say we invented. They say we remembered. The wind moves through the reeds along the Euphrates, carrying with it the sound of a language no one speaks anymore. Beneath the soil, beneath the cities, beneath the flood layers and the temples and the bones, clay tablets wait in the dark, pressed 5,000 years ago by hands that knew their words would outlast empires. Some have been found. Some have been translated. Some have been suppressed. But most still sleep beneath the sand, preserving truths we are only beginning to understand. If clay still remembers the world before us, what else is waiting beneath the soil to be found?